Now, 30 years ago, the world gathered in Beijing and made a historic commitment to advance gender equality through the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the most comprehensive global framework for the rights and the empowerment of women and girls. Today, on International Women's Day 2026, the world unites under the theme Rights, Justice, Action for all women and girls, a call not only to celebrate progress, but to close legal gaps, dismantle barriers. So at the center of many of these conversations is a woman whose leadership has shaped public policy, governance and gender equality, both in South Africa and globally. Joining us now is Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, Chairperson of the Beijing Plus 30 Africa Women's Movement. A very good afternoon to you, ma'am, and thank you so much for your time this afternoon. So if we can begin here,
thank
of course. All right. If we can begin here, and of course you were part of, South Africa's delegation to that very historic gathering in 1995. When you reflect on Beijing during that time, just 1 year after our very own democracy, of course, what did that moment represent for South African women and for women globally, do you think?
I'd want to raise two issues around that. When we in 1994, up to the Beijing conference, prepared as a country, there was a dialogue by women across the country speaking to the 12 critical areas in the Beijing Platform for Action. This conference came at a watershed time for us as a country, but also a time when South Africa, having just come out of a time of working towards democracy, and as we were developing our own constitution, we were absolutely clear as a people, and even as the Africa region, that the equality of women was non-negotiable. What did Beijing represent? It was the largest World Women's Conference that clearly was one where women came together, developed a compact as women from across the world that stated that women's rights are human rights. Today, sadly, and as reflected on the news that has been flighted as well, we almost ask the question of women's rights for whom, or rights for whom? Because after 3 decades of deliberation, we are saying now is the time for greater accountability, and this 31st year must be a year of implementation. The promise of peace and security remains unfulfilled as the rising tide of conflict and the deliberate erosion of international law threatens to unravel the decades of progress for women and girls. And we think it's deliberate, this. It's deliberate because of those who want to decide how they will determine the peace architecture. If I'm allowed to make this point, when we signed that social contract in 1995, one of the areas was the question of women and girls and education. And this area, interestingly, has developed the furthest. And yet we have a missile strike a few days ago on a school of girls in Iran. Isn't that an absolute violation, where there are backpacks of girls under the rubble? When we look at the Sudan, and you look at the fact that 85% of the budget is spent on the military and 15% on social programs, including education, clearly it shows that we don't have the peace that we deserve, a peace that includes not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice for every woman, girl, man, every youth across Africa and the world.
Yeah. And I think that's an important reflection, ma'am, particularly that last point of what's happening in the Middle East, particularly when you begin to understand that many are saying that, 3 decades later, that the Beijing platform remains the gold standard for advancing gender equality. And then you hear, of course, these devastating stories. But where do you believe the world, and South Africa specifically, has made those most meaningful progress since '95? And I want, for the benefit just of our viewers, to go back to the 12 key areas that you mentioned, those critical areas that you mentioned that were adopted in terms of the key focus areas at the conference in '95. The first one being women and poverty, education and training, health, violence against women, women in armed conflict, economic participation, power and decision-making, institutional mechanisms of equality, human rights of women, and of course, media representation, environmental management, and lastly, the rights and the well-being of the girl child. When you look at all of those, where do you think fundamentally over the last 3 decades there was meaningful change?
The most meaningful change was in the area of women and education, because we've achieved equal access to education by women. And this was done by far to the largest extent. A second area is, of course, the whole issue of women in power. So we've seen greater participation of women in politics, and you've particularly seen that amongst the lead countries in the world are African countries, Rwanda, you look at Namibia, you look at South Africa and all. So we've seen progress in those areas. Areas that we've seen the least progress in, sadly enough, is the area of women and conflict, women and gender-based violence. And it goes back to the point that I have just, the point I've just made earlier. And I actually just want to give you a statistic. So quickly, out of the 100, when we look at Beijing and again look at gender-based violence, we have 193 countries with gender-based violence laws. In many instances, the challenge lies in the implementation. So just in terms of facts. Also, if we would say, what should success look like 30 years after Beijing? Success is when a 7-year-old girl in MENA or Sudan or in the DRC can walk to a school without her parents fearing a missile strike. It also looks like gender responsive budgeting, where money is moved from arms into the care economy. I think this is what we want it to be. I earlier spoke, I didn't earlier, not on this program, but I want to give you 2 data points. Professor Stiglitz and Professor Linda Bulmers did a recent study, and they say out of the 1-to-3 debt ratio, every $1 that's spent on war today creates $3 in future ghost budgets. And this will cover areas like trauma care, debt, lost productivity. Secondly, if you look at job multipliers, $1 billion in education creates 26,700 jobs. And that's more than double the 11,600 jobs created in the military. And this would be in the US. If we look more broadly and globally, psychological scarring, trauma is an invisible tax. And that stays on the national balance sheet for more than 50 years. And we can see that. The Sudan reality is a 85-15-5 split, where 85% is spent on the budget, 5% on essential services like education, health, and agriculture. And 80% of hospitals are closed. That's the impact of that budget. 2.5 million girls are out of school. So in essence, we're moving back on a blueprint, on a compact that women of the world really crafted. And they crafted that from all corners of the world.
Yeah.
It was unanimously adopted by 189 countries.
Yeah.
And we see a backward movement. So one would almost feel that the time of deliberation is ended, and that we cannot build peaceful nations on, or in the Sudan, a peaceful nation on a 5% foundation of social services.
Yeah.
I'm probably going too broadly on this one. Yeah?
No, I appreciate the transparency. And I mean, I wanted to also touch on, but you've touched on it so well, you know, the issue of gender-based violence. And of course, the challenges when you look at economic inequality too, and why these gaps remain. And that is, I think, powerful. You've also touched on and spoken about just the need to move from policy commitments to implementation. What does intentional action then on gender equality look like in practice, do you think?
This is why we're calling for movements, a very powerful global women's movement. We've started in a small way on the African continent, and that's why we called it Beijing plus 30, because it's 3 decades since that social compact was crafted and adopted by women. And in delivering on commitments, we may well have moved from exclusion, but have we moved for tokenism? Because at current rates, it will take 286 years to close the gender gap. And we don't have 3 centuries for that. We need radical acceleration of the Beijing mandate to make a difference. The women at the table, if we look at peace deals, at the moment, 35% of peace deals are more likely to last when women are involved. Women must shift the focus from territory to truth, to negotiation, to bringing everyone around the table. If we look at the conflicts playing out, whether it's on the African continent, or it's in the Middle East, or it's the economic blockade on Cuba, when we look at who has arrived at those decisions, certainly women weren't in the majority.
Yeah.
And certainly those decisions were not reached at in a way that says, let's look at negotiation. Let's bring everyone around the table to talk. Because it's not weapons, it's not missiles that's going to end wars.
Yeah.
It's diplomacy that's required. And that's where we've made a very specific call for the need for a new peace architecture.
And I would imagine that would take women occupying those very important roles. And just as we close off our conversation, maybe I want you to take that a little bit further in terms of, you know, also if you look at it in South Africa, I mean, we are in an election year, hopefully at the end of the year or beginning of next year in local government though. But women remain, in the main, underrepresented in political and also decision-making spaces worldwide. I mean, what, very quickly if you can, ma'am, what systemic barriers, you know, continue to limit women's leadership?
To a large degree, it's the way in which political parties are structured that leads to systemic barriers for women, as well as the social construct, culture. And let's just get back to the reality. When you get to local politics, then you're going to find that women will be pushed out for men to occupy those positions. But I think what we need to look at is not only the political positions, because South Africa has again done fairly well on that. It's to what extent are we also leading and executing service delivery at all levels of the administration and government? Because at the end of the day, it's not only about the political heads that are there, it's also the collectives who are the implementers. And how do we ensure that women hold everyone accountable, from the level of the public servant at local government level who's delivering a service, those providing water, sanitation, healthcare and all? Do we hold them accountable? Having had Batupile charters put in place that require certain basic services to be met? Do we hold our ward councillors accountable? Do we attend ward meetings? Are we present in all structures? Because our constitution protects our ability to engage in all levels. And then the cherry on top will, of course, be one that ensures that there's more inclusive leadership. But it's not just around a single person, it's around the collectives that must take it forward, the collectives that should ensure that inequality is not a reality.
Absolutely. Ma'am, thank you so much for your time and your insights. Really, really do appreciate it. Appreciate your time. Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, Chairperson of the Beijing Plus 30 Africa Women's Movement, of course, also marking and reflecting on International Women's Day.